Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another COVID debunking video. So, a few months ago, I uploaded a video where I reviewed an episode of The Dr. Drew Show. This was an episode where Dr. Drew had Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has been one of the most prolific anti-vaxxers for the past decade. So, obviously, I was hoping that Dr. Drew would challenge a lot of the things that Robert was saying, that he would actually talk about the real science that shows maybe where Robert is going wrong in some places or everywhere. But no, Dr. Drew really didn't put up a fight at all. Aside from one pushback that he had when they were talking about the topic of HIV/AIDS, Drew pretty much agreed with almost everything that Robert was saying, or at the very least, just kind of let Robert say it, and that gave the impression to the audience that what he was saying had validity, because Robert was allowed to say it, and it didn't go unchallenged by someone who has a professional degree like Dr. Drew. So after I made that video, Dr. Drew actually invited me on to his show to talk about this. And so I went on his show. Now, before I did go on to his show, I didn't do any deep dive into Dr. Drew's content. I wasn't aware of how many anti-vaccine guests he had had on his channel, and I wasn't really aware of his stances on a lot of things. I knew that he had Robert on, and I knew that he had some questionable COVID opinions. I didn't know that it was as bad as it is, though. So going on to the show, I had some optimism. I thought that maybe we could come to an understanding that if he's going to have people like that on his show, he needs to challenge them. Even at one point, his wife chimed in, I think it was, and said that she agrees that he should challenge people like Robert more often. But I don't think that message was received at all from Drew. At least he didn't take it to heart and turn it into action, because his guests since then have pretty much all been the most popular anti-vaxxers at this time. And as far as I could see, he didn't really challenge any of what they had to say. He's platforming anti-vaxxers, and it's not okay, Drew. Your philosophy of bringing things into the light and having the light sorted out, that doesn't work. Especially not when you, a professional, platform these people who are spreading just demonstrably false, dangerous garbage, and you're practically sitting there agreeing with them. It's not okay. You should be promoting the good science and explaining what the data actually say, not going off of your own personal beliefs. So in this video, I'm going to talk about my experience on the Dr. Drew Show, some of the things we talked about, and why I think that Dr. Drew can't really be someone who calls himself pro-science or pro-vaccine anymore. So let's get started. So the conversation with Drew started out talking about my video that I made about his episode with RFK Jr. And we start talking about what RFK Jr. said about HIV/AIDS. And at that point, I was getting him to agree that, yeah, what Robert was saying about that was not correct, and that maybe he should have challenged him a little more. And that was all well and good. But just looking back at my interview and the episode with RFK Jr., I struggle to understand how Drew could have those feelings toward what Robert was saying, but then in the same episode go on to promote his book, which almost half of it spews HIV/AIDS nonsense and denialism. I don't really get that. And when we talked, his answer seemed to be that he just didn't want the conversation to devolve into shouting, or he wanted to be kind to his guest.
If you have a sort of a policy of silence, or I won't talk to him, or that's a bad person, it only adds to these people going into the fringes and circulating there and forming their own opinions. I really believe strongly in bringing things out into the open, whatever the opinions are.
I just don't buy it, Drew. That's not what a responsible science communicator does. You don't platform misinformation and then just let it run loose. But anyway, after the first half of this conversation, we started moving into COVID. And Drew said he had some questions for me about COVID-related topics, so I was happy to oblige, and we talked about some COVID stuff. The first thing that we talked about, where he said something that struck me as just a big red flag, was the topic of Paxlovid and Paxlovid rebound. The literature are quite clear that Paxlovid is a very, very effective antiviral that more Americans should be taking. We still have hundreds of Americans dying of COVID every day, and Paxlovid really should be bringing those numbers down lower. But a lot of people are hesitant to take it due to this idea that Paxlovid will give a rebound, or that Paxlovid can be taken later in the course of the viral infection when things are looking bad. And neither of those things are true. Paxlovid rebound is not a thing. I have made a video about this before. Paxlovid rebound is not Paxlovid rebound, it's just COVID. It's the normal course of COVID, where first you feel crummy, then you start to get better, and then your immune system has this big wave of cytokines and response, and then you feel really bad again, sometimes even worse than that first stage. This was seen before Paxlovid was a thing, and it's still seen after Paxlovid is a thing. It's just now that Paxlovid is here, it's all blamed on Paxlovid. But studies have been done looking at this, and they have found that the rates of rebound are identical in groups that either receive Paxlovid or don't receive Paxlovid. So it's not Paxlovid rebound. And I tried to explain this to Drew, but instead he just had this to say. And just to point out, the so-called rebound, the Paxlovid rebound that people sometimes talk about, that's really just the normal course of COVID. There's always been kind of two phases.
No. Sorry. I have people heading towards the hospital, getting severely ill. Stop it. It stops. They are like well for about 3 to 5 days, and then vavoom, it all comes back. And it tends to be more protracted when it comes back too. I've never seen anything like that in the routine course of COVID. Nothing like that. I get it. And that's the cytokine storm, so to speak, and the cytokine activation, all this stuff. That looks totally different. I'm telling you, that looks completely different than this. It just is clinically a very, very different syndrome. It just looks different.
There is literature where people compared, that rebound effect between patients who received Paxlovid and did not receive Paxlovid, and the rates of rebound were similar between the two groups. So
interesting.
I don't really think there's much to the Paxlovid rebound idea.
All right. Literature will continue. Usually, in my experience, when literature doesn't match my clinical experience, usually the literature catches up.
It's always a red flag when a doctor kind of ignores scientific literature and says, well, in my experience, the literature catches up to me. And in my experience, this is what I see, and I don't agree with it. It's really not a good sign. Doctors should always practice evidence-based medicine. When Drew said this, the words of Dr. Daniel Griffin came into my head, where he says that sometimes the worst thing a doctor can say is, in my experience, because usually they're ignoring data in order to substitute their own experience into a situation. I also found it weird that Drew just couldn't really pinpoint specific reasons. He just said, no, it looks different. Something about it's different, without really explaining exactly why he feels that way or what data might point to it actually being different. So that was just disappointing and bizarre. So after that, we came to a topic that I think we disagreed on the most, and it is the topic of vaccinating children with COVID vaccines. Dr. Drew seemed to be of the opinion that COVID doesn't pose enough of a threat to children in order to vaccinate them. So then I make the comparison of COVID to measles, which is another primarily childhood viral infection that caused a lot of death, hospitalization, and overall suffering before vaccines were introduced. He agreed with me that measles is something that he feels very strongly should be vaccinated for, but he says that it killed way more kids than COVID did. But in any case, my point was that you could make the same argument that COVID doesn't pose a significant enough risk to children with measles. You could absolutely portray absolute risk rates and overall death numbers to make an argument that children shouldn't be vaccinated against measles, but that is just ridiculous because we know that children benefit from vaccinating against measles. Similarly, we know that children benefit from being vaccinated against COVID. It reduces hospitalization, it reduces long COVID, it reduces the chance of death. All of these things are worth preventing, especially in children. So I was trying to get him to maybe see a parallel there, but apparently no luck. So then we talked a little bit about myocarditis. I explained that myocarditis seen with vaccination is different from myocarditis seen with viral infection. But he pushed back against this. So apparently he doesn't have a problem pushing back against me, but he will let anti vaxxers say things that he later says he disagrees with right on the spot. So weird. Anyway, he expresses concern that we don't know the long term effects of this myocarditis seen in children, that there might be effects we don't know about that are making them more susceptible to things later down the line. I heard him, sure, whatever, those are concerns, but the data just aren't leaning towards supporting that right now. And I told him that vaccines causing myocarditis is not new, and we never noticed any long term effects that those cases of myocarditis would have on the heart of those people after they recovered. In reality, almost all of the people who have experienced myocarditis following COVID vaccination have recovered uneventfully. Some follow up studies have claimed to show some abnormal heart readings or scarring of the heart tissue, but it's really unclear what kind of clinical implications these have or really how significant the findings actually are. Meanwhile, with COVID infection, not only can your heart be damaged, but it can be damaged much more severely than after a vaccine. It can also damage your lungs, damage your kidneys, land you in the hospital, and just it's not worth it. It is not worth taking the road of more risk when it comes to COVID. Taking the road of less risk, which is choosing vaccination, is the clear choice. And I don't know why Dr. Drew doesn't see it that way. Anyway, there wasn't much more notable stuff that happened in the interview before we came to the end, where Drew asked me if I think that he is anti-vaccine and anti-science. I thought that we had had a good conversation and that maybe he was warming up to some of the things I was telling him. He thanked me and told me that I helped him on some of these things. So I was going to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I said, based on this conversation, no. And honestly, I'm not going to lie, I was a little intimidated. I didn't want to just say right there that, yeah, he's anti-vaccine and anti-science. I thought that would be offensive to him and maybe cut off all communication following that interview. So I didn't want to say that.
So now you've talked to me at length, and you've helped me a good deal, and I appreciate it very much. I think you've helped the audience also. Am I anti-vax?
I mean, I wouldn't say so based on this conversation. However, I did wait and watch his interviews. I watched his channel, the kind of guests he had, whether or not he challenged them, and I was very disappointed. I can say now that, Drew, I do think that you are anti-science, and I do not think you are pro-vaccine. I don't care if you support MMR vaccination or pertussis vaccination. Denying COVID vaccine science still makes you anti-vaccine. Denying COVID vaccine science makes you anti-science. So I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the guests that he has had on his show since I've been on it, and I'm just going to point out how deep down the anti-science hole Dr. Drew has gone. His guests have included Ryan Cole twice. Ryan Cole is an MD, a pathologist, who was featured in the Died Suddenly documentary, or I should say mockumentary, where he talks about weird pathological findings in COVID vaccine patients. Findings that he, for some reason, doesn't want to publish, but he has no problem showing pictures of his findings to anybody who will listen at conferences and on shows like this. I've debunked Ryan Cole on this channel a couple times before, and yet Drew didn't seem to really challenge him at all. He took his pictures at face value, didn't even ask if he had published this data or if there was a control stain for any of the images that he was showing to show any background coloration that might happen in normal cells that he knows aren't vaccinated. Basic questions that Drew just didn't ask. He's also had Richard Urso on his show, who has pushed a lot of anti-vaccine misinformation, brought up this IgG4 class switching observation that really is nothing to worry about, and I've talked about it on my channel before, but Drew doesn't challenge that, doesn't push back on it, doesn't ask him any meaningful questions to explain how he knows that this is a bad thing. None of that. He's also had Steve Kirsch, the worst, most vile anti-vaxxer, on his show, and treated him very favorably. That should be all you need to know, but I'll keep going. He also had Asim Malhotra, one of the most trending anti-vaxxers of today, who again spewed a lot of anti-vaccine misinformation, and it went unchallenged. And finally, recently he had Del Bigtree on his show, one of the most prolific anti-vaxxers who has been running anti-vaccine talk shows and producing anti-vaccine movies for several years now. And guess what? Dr. Drew viewed him favorably and even promoted his work. It's really sad to see. So, for all of these reasons, Drew, you're not pro-science. You're not pro-vaccine. You are platforming misinformation and disinformation, and you're not just platforming it, you're promoting it. You're not challenging it. You're not giving your audience good science. You are presenting them with bad science and not giving them the tools that they need to think through it themselves. You're just presenting it as it is, and when you don't challenge it, it makes it look like you believe it. And you do in a lot of these cases. So, really, Dr. Drew, be better, please. And if you're going to ask me back on your show, I appreciate it, but my answer is no. I'm not going to go back on your platform, which is amplifying the voices of so many anti-vaxxers. However, I will talk to you outside of your show. I'll talk to you in a neutral public platform. I'll talk to you privately. Whatever you want to do. But what you're doing right now is not helping the scientific community. It's hurting science communication. You are legitimizing several prolific anti-vaxxers and their demonstrably false disinformation. It's sad to see. So, Drew, I really hope that you change. And if any of his listeners are watching this right now, I'll encourage you to not listen to Dr. Drew. Instead, listen to This Week in Virology. This is a platform with several experts from several different fields that talk about actual science, and I promise you'll learn a lot more there than you will listening to the Dr. Drew Show. So there you have it. That was my experience on the Dr. Drew Show. As always, thank you so much for watching. All the links to all of the science that I talked about in this video are linked in the description below so that you can read them for yourself. And if you like this video, then make sure to like it and then subscribe so that you can catch me next week, where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.